Okay, this is my case study of the April 2011 tornadoes. So from April 25th to 28th, 2011, there was significant tornado activity in the southeast. April of 2011 was the most active month for tornadoes on record, with 750 tornadoes across the United States. The majority of those struck in the southeast, and the outbreak that occurred between April 25th and 28th of 2011 caused $11 billion in damages and killed 321 people throughout the southeast. April 27th was a day that most people in Alabama will not forget, including myself. I'm a resident of Birmingham, Alabama, where one of the tornadoes struck. April 27th, 2011 was considered a super outbreak, and there were 4 EF5 and 11 EF4 tornadoes that day. Alabama had a total of 62 confirmed tornadoes, and central Alabama, where I live, saw those tornadoes in 2 waves. So in the early morning, there were 11 confirmed tornadoes. Most of those were EF3 or lower, all were EF3 or lower. And then another wave in the afternoon and evening with 18 confirmed tornadoes, with 4 EF4 tornadoes and 1 EF5. And that's because as the day progressed, the sun came out and the air got warmer and collided with the cold air. So you can see here damages and loss. The map on the left of the screen, you can see here the purple line that extends from Marion County to Lawrenceburg through Limestone County. That was a significant EF5 tornado with sustained winds of 210 miles per hour. That tornado just decimated a small city called Hackleburg, where they lost nearly every structure, residential and business. That tornado had a path of just over 25 miles and caused 100 injuries and 18 fatalities. The second tornado that's significant is this red line, the tornado. It's labeled number 39. That had the longest path of the day. It was an EF4 with sustained winds of about 170 miles an hour. It had a path of over 116 miles. But because that path was in more rural areas, so these counties where it starts in Pickens, goes over the top of Tuscaloosa County, Walker, bottom of Coleman County and Blount County, all that is very rural area. And so while it was the longest tornado, it only produced 54 injuries and 13 fatalities. And then the most significant tornado that did the most damage was this EF4 here, labeled number 44. It started in Greene County, but it moved very quickly. The sustained winds were 190 miles per hour. It was an EF4 tornado, and it passed through the urban areas of Tuscaloosa, the cities of Tuscaloosa and Birmingham. And so because of that, there were many more deaths. This tornado, with the winds of 190 miles per hour, produced over 1,500 injuries and 65 fatalities. Its path was just over 80 miles, but it was the width of about 26 football fields. It was 2,600 yards wide. So you can see here the first EF5 tornado. So you had some significant loss of life here in these counties. This path is the track here on this tornado death here. And so there was 243 in the state that day. Fayette, Walker, Coleman, and Marshall, that was the long kind of tracked EF4, but because it was rural, you don't have as many deaths. And then here in Tuscaloosa and Jefferson, you see where significant deaths occur because of the urban areas that it hit. So damages and loss. Tuscaloosa had 50 fatalities, more than 1,000 injuries, and over 7,000 damaged structure. Birmingham proper, which is the city of Birmingham, and then the outlying municipalities or suburbs, had 37 fatalities and more than 600 injuries. And then throughout the state, rural towns and communities were also hit fairly hard. Again, the city of Hackleburg, which is in Marion County, was decimated. Lots of those communities lost their only or their major employer. And because of that, migration resulted, and then that further impacted those communities economically. Overall in the state that day, there were 243 fatalities and over 2,500 injuries, and more than $10 billion of property loss. I'm going to quickly kind of explain this picture. This is in Tuscaloosa. This main street that people are walking on is University Boulevard. And if you could turn around and see, the person took the picture of standing on the corner of University Boulevard and 15th Street, which is a major intersection in Tuscaloosa. So right off to the left of the picture and across the street, all that is commercial property, but then right behind the commercial property start residential neighborhoods. Many homes were rental homes for university students, and then right behind these trees is DCH Regional Medical Center. Unfortunately, it was spared. But here you can see this is a residential neighborhood that was right behind the commercial property from this very previous picture. And so before and after is fairly significant in its damage. So key players, it's a little kind of inside joke here in Alabama. James Spann is a very well-known, well-educated meteorologist, and he's actually, most people sort of almost worship him. He knows his business, certainly in the weather area. And so we have a little kind of inside joke. If James Spann has his entire suit on, even if it's raining, you're probably a-okay. But when his suit jacket comes off and his sleeves get rolled up and you can see his suspenders, then you probably need to sit up and take notice, because he's got something to say. Other key players were the first responders, police and fire of every municipality and surrounding community. One of the things to note is that a lot of the rural areas, their first responders and firemen are all volunteer. The county emergency operations centers and emergency management agencies, the health departments, local leaders. So Walt Maddox is the mayor of Tuscaloosa, and he actually, we'll talk about him in a little bit, but he actually played a pretty key role in having Tuscaloosa prepared. And then area hospitals. And the three area hospitals would be DCH Regional Medical Center in Tuscaloosa, University of Alabama at Birmingham, or UAB Hospital, which is a level 1 trauma facility, and then Children's of Alabama, which is also a level 1 trauma center for children. State leaders and agencies, Governor Robert Bentley, he established the Governor's Emergency Relief Fund after, in the math of the tornadic activity that month. The Alabama Department of Public Health, Tim Hatch, who is the Environmental Program Director of the Center for Emergency Preparedness, was also instrumental in having people prepared. The Alabama Department of Environmental Management, Alabama Emergency Management Agency, and then federal leaders and agencies included President Barack Obama, FEMA, and the Department of Homeland Security. Non-governmental organizations, key players, the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, Serve Alabama, the Community Foundation of Greater Birmingham, the United Way of Central Alabama, Christian Service Mission, and YMCA of Alabama. President Obama, the President and First Lady actually visited Tuscaloosa, Birmingham, and other communities that they could get to on Friday, I think it was a Friday, the 29th. Anyway, 2 days later after the tornado, they were on the ground in Alabama. And this picture that's taken here, I was actually at this shelter volunteering. This was a medical needs shelter. And so if you had significant medical needs, then you were directed to this shelter, to door 2 in Birmingham, to one of these shelters. And so nurses volunteered their time. And I was there when the President and First Lady came. And I will say the picture is exactly what you saw. They spent over an hour with residents of the shelter, speaking with them, talking about their needs, and they were very attentive. And regardless of whatever political party you belong to, they really made those people feel respected and important, which was very nice. Response to the threat of severe weather. So we've gotten very good at predicting severe weather. I know this because in 1999, when I was a very brand new nurse working at Children's in the emergency room, we had an F5 tornado go through northern Birmingham, and some of the outlying communities were hit very hard. That tornado hit in the middle of the night. radar wasn't as good, and there were no smartphones in 1999. There were no weather apps. People were really dependent on emergency sirens, some of which did not work. And so the loss of life was significant. Whereas here, the risk for the severe weather on April 27th was actually predicted early, a day earlier. So on the 26th, we knew that the 27th was probably not going to be a great day. Because of that, many schools and businesses closed ahead of time to prepare for the storm. So people laugh about that. But about 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, a city in South Alabama was hit pretty hard by an EF4 tornado. They kept the kids at school because they thought the schools would be safer than their homes, because it was a rural area and a lot of them lived in manufactured housing. But one of the walls of one of the schools fell and killed, I believe, like 6 to 10 kids. So the schools don't want the kids in school anymore. Tornado watches were issued with an average of about 2.4 hours of lead time, and warnings were issued with an average of about 22 minutes lead time. And with the EF4 tornado that went through Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, that lead time for those in its path was estimated at about 36 to 42 minutes. This picture is actually of my children that day. We are sheltered. We did have probably almost an hour notice. So you can see they have their bike helmets on. We have pillows. In front of them is a mattress that you can't see to protect them. Because up until about 10 minutes before it hit Birmingham, we were directly in its path. And then the tornado made a little bit of a turn towards the north, which was also significant. The southern area of Birmingham and the suburbs that lie south of Birmingham are much more populated than the north. There was a first wave of tornadoes that day in Birmingham, and so people were already on alert and sheltered. And then Birmingham hospitals, because of the risk for severe weather, had activated their disaster plans. And so the first activations, employees were on alert that there might be a need for them if an external disaster occurred. And you can see here, this is James Spann. Again, this is just radar. And then this picture is actually taken on top of Red Mountain, where all of the news stations are. And if you turned around and put your back to that tornado, this is the EF4 tornado. If you put your back to that, you would look at my house. So as the crow flies, it was probably only about 4 miles away from us. It's important to note that after the tornado, when we were outside and looking for damage or anything like to our roof or anything, there was significant debris in our yard, letters, pictures, wooden stakes that were driven down into the ground. It was fairly surreal. So the response, the night before, Governor Bentley declared a state of emergency. And because when he did that, then the National Guard was activated and given immediate response authority. State leaders had started to gather at the headquarters for the Alabama Emergency Management Agency. And those headquarters are in Clanton, Alabama, which is halfway between Montgomery, the capital, and Birmingham. So it's just south of Birmingham. In Tuscaloosa, we'll kind of go back to Walt Maddox. The city leadership, he realized, was no one was really prepared. When he first became mayor in about 2008, they were running a drill, a disaster drill, based on a dirty bomb in the football stadium, because Tuscaloosa is home to the University of Alabama, and football is almost a religious experience in Alabama, according to some people. So they were running this drill, and he realized that nobody knew what they were doing. So he made everyone participate in a week-long training course, so the community-specific integrated emergency management course at FEMA in 2009. And then over the next 2 years, they didn't just go to the training, then they practiced it. So they activated the incident command system for fixed events, like there was an air show of the Blue Angels in Tuscaloosa, and then home football games. He did activate the ICS ahead of the storms, because there was such a high risk for tornadic activity. When he did that, then DCH Health System canceled all elective surgeries and activated its external disaster plan. And then that afternoon at 5:13 p.m. or 17:13, the tornado entered the southwest corner of the city and left behind a 6-mile path of just destruction in only a few minutes. Birmingham, the first wave of tornadoes that occurred in central Alabama, there was actually an EF2 tornado that hit just south of the city in the suburb of Vestavia Hills, which is also about 4 miles from me. So I was really in between those two tornadoes. And that happened at about 5:54 a.m. Once that hit, the ICS for Jefferson County emergency operations and local municipalities were activated. Then hospitals activated their external disaster plans, and non-emergent and elective surgeries were canceled, and workers were called in. Due to the state of emergency called by Governor Bentley, area schools that were not already closed for the day then closed and let students out. So all students were at home by noon or earlier that day. The EF4 tornado that had destroyed part of Tuscaloosa crossed into northern Birmingham at about 5:47 or 17:47. And so Birmingham residents did have about an average of 30 minutes or so to prepare for that. Because of the activation of the emergency declaration of disaster that Governor Bentley did, the National Guard was actually in place and ready to go, and those they actually showed up along with the first responders. I think it took them a little bit longer to get to Tuscaloosa just from where they were, so it took them about 30 minutes to get to Tuscaloosa. In Birmingham, they were there almost immediately. They assisted with house-to-house search and rescue, and they provided traffic control as well. In the federal agencies, FEMA representatives were on the ground within hours, and again, the President and First Lady were on the ground 2 days later. Not all the non-governmental organizations, they were also on the ground within hours. They provided shelter and essentials such as food and water. And I want to back up and say also that on the night of the 27th, kind of later that day, in that night, President did sign an emergency declaration that night for the state. So the role of public health, the Alabama Department of Public Health, they led and coordinated the public health and healthcare sectors. Because of Tim Hatch, who was the environmental program director of the Center for Emergency Preparedness, all of the county health departments had participated in environmental health training and emergency response. They were trained and ready to go. And because they were prepared, they were really able to quickly go into recovery mode. They were able to calculate injuries and fatalities. They were able to help reroute first responders around rubble and through rubble-blocked streets. And they were able to make some rapid assessments. They were also able to coordinate with county health officials on the environmental health issues that come with a disaster such as a tornado. So obviously there's no power. So they were able to coordinate with the power company, Southern Company, to make sure that lines that were down were not live. And then when you don't have power, then your safe water supply is threatened. So they were able to coordinate with the departments on water and water safety and whether or not mandatory boil and mandatory water conservation declarations needed to be made, which they did do in Tuscaloosa for about 36 to 48 hours. Birmingham did not have to do that. Food becomes an issue because without power, there's no refrigeration. Restaurants obviously want to help, but if that food hasn't been maintained at an appropriate temperature, they really should not serve it because then you get some foodborne pathogens that take out some of your workers. And sanitation, the same thing. If the power is out, then at some point toilets don't flush anymore because the water is not there. Relationships, because of the training, relationships had also already been established, which meant that policies and contingency plans were already in place. So debris removal, portable toilet facilities, all that they were able to bring those in and get all of that coordinated with a very quick kind of turnover because the training had already taken place and those plans were already in place. The Alabama Department of Public Health and the Public Health Emergency Preparedness, again, they established medical needs shelters and a mobile pharmacy with medications and oxygen supplies for people who, lost everything. They didn't have medications, they maybe didn't have their O2, that kind of thing. The medical needs shelters were actually staffed by the Alabama Department of Public Health. So they had their nurses in charge, and then they subsequently were in charge of the volunteer nurses. So I reported to a public health nurse that day. Even though I'm a nurse practitioner, I was really more functioning in the role of a nurse and reported to her, to another nurse. Area hospitals set up triage stations outside of their ERs according to their external disaster plans, and the Alabama Department of Public Health sent 2 nurses to each hospital for triage to assist with triage, and those nurses really essentially took over because they were more prepared for kind of the in the ICS manner than the hospital nurses themselves. And so that happened at DCH, UAB, and Children's of Alabama. The Alabama Emergency Management Agency, in collaboration with the Department of Public Health and county health departments, they immediately helped identify shelters for those who were displaced. A lot of people reported or kind of would straggle into fire stations, and they were not necessarily shelters. And so they helped to coordinate that and kind of spread that information. The information officer was able to get that to the news agencies, and all that was able to be released to the public fairly quickly. During cleanup and recovery and debris removal, the Department of Public Health distributed thousands of PPE equipment to volunteers that were assisting, not only to prevent lung and eye irritation, but also just when you're in all that kind of debris, there's a lot of rodents and insects and stuff that can spread disease, and so it's important to have PPE. You can see this is an aerial view. This is how wide you can see just the magnitude of the destruction, and kind of sometimes there's sort of no rhyme or reason with some houses standing in the middle of the debris, still standing, while others are just totally gone. The immediate response was fairly good. They were on AEMA and the FEMA were on the ground quickly to provide advice and support almost immediately. Multiple fire stations in the rural areas. So let me back up. The urban areas had a great response. The rural areas didn't have such a good response. In the rural areas, remember, a lot of them are volunteers, so they're first responders and their firefighters, they're all volunteer. And a lot of those fire stations and emergency operations centers were either destroyed or damaged, heavily damaged. And so they couldn't even function out of them. Plus you add in the fact that they themselves were victims. It made for some slower response times in those areas. And communications were also hit fairly hard, although the telephone system, the power company has a sort of backup system, but a lot of those rural areas didn't have access to that. So they had some delays in response. Major operations of EMA and FEMA were roadway access, search, rescue, treatment, and transport of citizens, self-protection and survival, and then just survival needs. So what did they need and what do the people need? So food, water, shelter, and sanitation. And that was easy. That was helpful. I mean, it was a fairly good response in the even in the rural areas for those needs. People really stepped up. One of the significant issues that they identified after the fact was the overload of the 911 system for missing persons. So as you can see, the destruction is massive. And so that means your cell phone towers, everything is down and nobody can communicate. And so there was an influx of calls to the 911 systems of people looking for their loved ones, especially in Tuscaloosa, where you have college students and parents, see the news and then can't get in touch with their child, and they don't know whether their child is okay or not. So that was a kind of a weak link, the weakest link, I would say, in the entire response in the ICS response. So social media actually did take over in that, and someone created a Facebook page. While it was not official, it did help take some of the burden off of the emergency command centers. Cleanup and recovery. So once your kind of initial search and rescue is over, you really kind of go into recovery mode. And this is where your non-GMO NGOs really step up. So Serve Alabama and the United Ways of Alabama partnered, and they coordinated over 52,000 volunteers and logged over 325,000 volunteer hours. And that's actually not counting some private entities like the YMCA. So lots of volunteers and lots of hours logged. Red Cross was on the ground within hours providing basic necessities. The Salvation Army helped coordinate with the Alabama Department of Public Health and provide shelters. And then they took over that from the ICS people, and they handled all of that in the kind of recovery and cleanup. And then the Christian Service Mission is a private organization. They coordinated all the donations. So if you wanted to do something, you wanted to step up and donate or do something, the Christian Service Mission in Birmingham was where you went. They coordinated all the donations and logged over $10 million worth of donated items. So I took my children down one Saturday. They realized there was a very large need for diapers, and they sent that call out. And within hours, they had just cases of diapers. And so we actually, with some other people, sorted all those diapers into size and counted them and everything. So lots of volunteers. And this is Pleasant Grove, that picture is. There was a lot of monetary assistance in the form of federal grants and aids. So this is a FEMA map that shows anybody in orange that was affected qualified for not only individual assistance but public assistance as well. With the assistance of the AEMA, Alabama received over $361 million in the form of grants and aids. The Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs provided over $75 million in federal assistance grants. The Governor's Emergency Relief Fund was established after the fact in response to help with unmet needs. They raised over $6 million over the course of about a year and a half, and over $5.8 million of that has gone to help victims of the 2011 tornadoes. And then the Community Foundation of Greater Birmingham assisted in setting up online donation points. They, along with a entertainment management company, put on the Bama Rising concert that was held in Tuscaloosa and raised over $2 million. They reached out to corporations for partnerships, and they also assisted in identifying some unmet needs. The community was super resilient. The communities of Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, there's a strong sense of community and community ties, and that led most families to either rebuild or rather than relocate. There was some migration in more rural areas where employees were lost, but in the larger communities, most stayed and rebuilt. You can't see it in this picture; it's kind of cut off, but it says, "Good news! Today we will have church," and that date is actually May the 1st, so just a few days after the tornado hit. And this is Pratt City, Alabama, which is right north of Birmingham. People of every race, age, religion, and socioeconomic demographic immediately stepped up to volunteer. There were a lot of "What can I do? What can I do? What can I do?" Community churches held services together and invited those whose churches were maybe destroyed. Schools reopened as quickly as they could, and then post-traumatic counseling was provided not only in schools to children, but also in shelters to adults who had experienced the trauma of the tornado. And then even a year, this happens every year with the Alabama Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. They sponsor a week of service, giving, and prayer to mark the anniversary of the tornadoes. And so you can either give a financial gift, there are ways that you can donate your time, or you can just pray. So changes made in the government response as people sort of evaluated the response. They did realize there was a lack of disaster preparedness in rural areas, so they increased their education of responders on emergency operation plans in the ICS system. They increased disaster management training and education, provided a lot of education on public assistance and the forms that need to be filled out to receive government aid and that kind of thing. There was a need, obviously, to include public works departments, and that was kind of overlooked in some initial plans. And so now they revamped plans to include public works, such as sanitation, trash services, that kind of thing. There's now a plan for 911 triage and a plan for use of alternate facilities in case the 911 facilities are destroyed. Education of the public on available storm shelters, education of the public on disaster preparedness. You can't do enough education on those two things. And then building and construction code changes were made, especially with in regards to manufactured housing. In the more rural areas of Alabama, there's a whole lot of manufactured housing. And if those are not built and anchored appropriately, you have a higher risk of not only home loss, but of mortality. So changes made in community improvements. With the assistance of the Governor's Emergency Relief Fund and AEMA, funding was provided in over 4,500 residential safe rooms and community shelters have been built since 2011. Funds were also used to provide weather band or NOAA radios to people who may not have a smartphone or access to any other system that would provide them any kind of an alert. Funds were used to improve public warning systems and alarms and sirens, and to educate the public on their role in disaster preparedness. Children's of Alabama distributed thousands of child safety kits during the 2011-2012 school year. And in those kits is a slap bracelet where parents can write the child's name, a phone number, any allergies, and their date of birth to help with identification processes. As children come in, and if they're young, we don't know who they are, and sometimes they're not found in the house but outside. And so that just helps with that. And then local meteorologists visit local schools to provide education to children. They also provide education to communities, and usually at libraries and community centers. And then this picture is actually a shelter in Pratt City, which was this community here. So this is the community shelter for Pratt City. It opened in the fall of 2017. And about 3 weeks ago, we had some pretty severe weather. And they opened the shelter ahead of that severe weather, and the local news media was there, and there were lots of people there using the shelter, excited that the shelter, they felt better, they weren't as anxious or scared. This shelter can hold upwards of 200 people and sustain winds of over 300 miles per hour. So it's a fairly significant shelter for that community, and they were very excited about that. And then these slides are my references. Thank you very much.